In this segment, we're going to talk about dangers of automation, or basically how does the arrival of NLP technology that can do all sorts of things automatically potentially lead to problems when maybe those things would have been done by people previously. So this is an issue that predates super strong neural net NLP methods. There have been issues with things like machine translation for quite a while. For example, this story from 2017 where Facebook apologized after they mistranslated something that a Palestinian man wrote. He wrote "good morning," but they translated it as attack them and hurt them, and actually led to the man being arrested. So there have been a number of issues where machine translations being taken as real led to harm, and potentially, not being able to understand something might have been better in this case than being able to kind of misunderstand it. There are also a lot of cases where we might translate things in ways that are technically correct on some level, but which involve, for example, offensive terms or things which in another language have a very different connotation. And this is the kind of thing that we want our models to be sensitive to, right? And there is this broader cultural context that sometimes gets washed away when you just take these models and try to maximize likelihood on some corpus. There's also this question of bias, which we talked about before, but when you automate things, there's a kind of separate issue of that bias creeping into your processes and your output in a way that's hard to verify. So there was this story from Amazon where they were using an AI resume screening tool. And when they looked at what this tool was learning, it basically decided that being in a women's X organization or being from a women's college was a negative weight feature. And so it would be more likely to reject people from women's colleges, which is discriminatory. Now, it's a little bit tricky because we can look at that and say, well, this was a bad model or something went wrong here. But it's actually not clear whether from a machine learning perspective anything went wrong, because they may have trained this on data from their actual recruiting process, and it may be that human biases were also playing a role in this recruiting process, and maybe the model accurately learned to reflect those. So it's not just a question of like, oh, you have to use a better learning rate or something like that. There's this kind of general context that these systems operate in that you really need to be sensitive of, all the way from data to model to deployment. And at every step of the way, there's kind of possibilities for things to go wrong. Another challenge is when these models can generate toxic content. And we've talked a little bit about this before, but when you show these models a prefix, like "I'm sick of all the politically correct blank," the fact that this model has been trained on the whole internet means that you're likely to get the types of things that people said when you started with this. And you might think that this is a somewhat innocuous phrase, and then it can go off, kind of off the rails into territory that you didn't necessarily want your text generation system to go. So when you automate things, you kind of get the ability to do all of this kind of, to produce all of this kind of stuff, and some of it may not be things that you wanted to produce. One of the biggest papers that's made some of the biggest splash about these questions of dangers of automation is this paper from Google by Bender, Gebru, McMillan-Major, and Schmitchell, which is a long story, called "Stochastic Parrots." So this described several dangers of large language models, largely surveying from previous literature. The first claim is that there's an environmental cost to training these models, that they have a very large carbon footprint to train and deploy, and that this kind of environmental cost is largely borne by marginalized populations. Another claim is that these are based on massive data sets which are challenging to audit. So these questions about things like toxicity are hard to address and hard to kind of fully stamp out. It's hard to take these systems and really kind of understand everything that's going into them. And finally, the last one, which I'll expand a little bit more on, is that their complaint is that these models are not really grounded in meaning. And when they generate an answer to a question, it's from learning these kind of textual co-occurrences that may only have the sort of meaning that we project on them, which is kind of getting back to some of the ideas we talked about in grounding. So you could generate basically text about, in this case, the Wagner mercenary group. And we look at this and it looks very factual. And so we're likely to kind of project on like this assumption that, oh, okay, this must be this kind of authoritative text. But we're not really sure. We've talked about how we need to maybe have better processes for fact checking these things. And similarly, if you ask a system for advice, it will often give very authoritative advice, maybe with a mild disclaimer, but this can potentially cause serious harm, and it's not necessarily a well-calibrated model for understanding medicine. So as these tools like ChatGPT get deployed more widely, there are risks that they get used for these sort of off-label things and can lead to real harm. And this is part of the ongoing conversation about how much should we, regulate or put labels on these things to try to prevent this from happening. That's the end of this segment.